This fall, bring the beauty of the Rabbit Room into your own community with House Moot. It's a self-hosted gathering where your living room, church, or backyard becomes a place for shared stories, songs, and sacred conversations. With recorded sessions, recipes, activities, discussion questions, and a gathering guide, we'll set the table for you. All you have to do is bring the guests. Get everything you need to host your own House Moot at rabbitroom.com/housemoot.
Because when we're reading writing, we're reading the expression of the whole person, the labor of the whole person. Your writing is your voice in your absence. It's also your blood and your sweat and your tears and everything else. And you might think, oh, no one appreciates that, but somebody will feel that.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Carolyn Weber was our special guest at the Habit Summer Writers Weekend this past June. Carolyn is the author of Surprised by Oxford and Sex in the City of God. She's also a professor at New College Franklin in Franklin, Tennessee. The following conversation was recorded in front of a live audience of writers. Carolyn and I talk about memoir writing, the memoirist's ever-developing sense of self, and what it means to be both honest and honoring of others in a memoir. Carolyn Weber, welcome to a live recording of the Habit Podcast at the Habit Summer Writers Weekend 2025.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
And this crowd was so glad to hear that you were coming. A lot of Carolyn Weber fans here.
Thank you.
So, of course, you have published two memoirs. Mm-hmm. Surprised by Oxford, Sex in the City of God. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, those books came out 7 years apart. Mm-hmm. I guess there's two different questions. Two different memoirs, and then you had 7 years to change as a writer and as a person. Mm-hmm. What was it like? Can you talk to the difference between writing a memoir in 2013 and 2020? I mean, the difference in you as a writer in those three, or the difference in, for that matter, your sense of yourself over that.
That's a great question. Birth. Both in terms of children and in terms of writing. So after I wrote, when I wrote Surprised by Oxford, I had 3 children under 3. So I hid in a closet and wrote on a 2x4, literally, while I was on sabbatical from a secular institution that told me not to write about my faith or else I would lose my position. Mm-hmm. So I was waiting to get tenure. That was the advice I had. And I received tenure and had the sabbatical, and I lied about the project and said I was doing something else, and I wrote that one instead. So my children were very little. I was in Santa Barbara on a visiting professorship at the time, on a sabbatical, and then visiting professorship at Westmont College. And then we went up to Canada after that. I wrote, actually, a kind of a smaller, it is more of a reflection on being present, but it was called Holy is the Day, and that was a smaller one in between. And then later I wrote Sex in the City of God when we were living in Canada. So Holy is the Day when we first arrived, and I was pregnant with our 4th, which was a surprise pregnancy and a complicated one. And then Sex in the City of God, I had actually mentioned that title as a joke to my publisher at the time, IVP, and she thought it was hilarious, and they kept it. And I had sort of meant it tongue-in-cheek, because of the reference to Augustine, obviously, but also for many years, students coming to me having one-night stands or talking about relationships, especially at secular places, and still feeling really lost. Mm-hmm. And, when you're a professor, you have a lot of students that meet with you about technicalities of writing, work, research, but also about life. Mm-hmm. And so that had been percolating for a long time. And during the process of kind of writing and thinking about what relationships are, really things boil down to 2 different citizenships. As Augustine puts it, we belong to either the city of man or the city of God. And they're 2 very different passports with 2 very different destinations. And I was really, really thinking about that. And during that arc was when my father passed too. So we had gone up to Canada to spend some time initially for a year or 2. And then we ended up staying longer to have this this pregnancy and delivery, and then to care for my father, who had eventually become a Christian when we were there with him, and then his decline. And so I think in the process of those years of caring for 4 small children, caring for my elderly parents, my father and his decline and his passing, and then who became a Christian. And my mom moved in with us. We cared for her. She eventually also became a Christian, which is a beautiful thing, but also complicated, as we all know, right? Caring for, we're all complicated. My mom also went through becoming sober in that process, living with us, and that, so it was a very rich, powerful moment. So I think those things shifted and changed me very much between the two, as we hope to be changed, right, in the Lord as we're growing between those two different stories, and I think that. I think Sex and the City of God came out just as COVID was descending. Mm-hmm. So just really thinking again about what it means to have relationships, and I think whenever we lose our parents, in particular, regardless of our relationship with them, it's cosmos tilting. You know, when we lose a parent, there's all different forms of grief, and then later I would lose my mom and my brother. Shortly in that time span too. So I think a lot of those things went into that arc of shifting and changing, but also I think of not. I'm always wary, especially when I look at women authors, of like the so-called lapses when they didn't write anything. Right? I think of Virginia Woolf, who wrote, that it was the almost all they could do was to raise bare walls out of the bare earth. I have often felt that way when you're taking care of little ones and taking care of elderly people, and you're a caregiver, and it's a very holy thing. But it's hard to write even a few lines at times. Yeah. Sometimes your reading life is your lifeline in that way.
Yeah. You mentioned your parents, and one of the people here, as we were talking about your visit, she asked if I would ask you about the question of, on the one hand, being honest about the people in your life who. People who may have hurt you, and at the same time honoring those people. And obviously you had to do some thinking about how to achieve that balance. What can you tell us about that?
I know, because that really, when I wrote my first memoir, I had never written a memoir before. I'd always been an academic writer, and I felt really compelled to do it in terms of sharing my story, especially because of my students and my unbelieving family and friends, and that weighed on me greatly. And I prayed a lot. And the first thing I highly recommend is just have a really, really good friend who is your reading, editing friend, the one that your soul sister or soul brother who will walk with you, because my dear friend, who's also a spiritual director and just a very attuned person, said to me, okay, you write your first draft and then that goes in a golden chest and no one ever has to know about it. That's the one that's cathartic, or whatever else, and then just work and pray over. And it really came down to the golden rule, do unto others as you'd want done unto you. So I think wanting to write about someone is how I would want to be written about. And if I couldn't write about that person in a way that I would want to be written about, then either changing identifying characteristics and working with the publisher for what is still fair or ethical in that, or consulting that person, having personal responsibility for how we represent other images of God. And I think it's also, writing memoir, especially as a Christian, is a particularly sort of spiritually self-reflective genre, because you're always looking at not writing from a place of anger or bitterness. Sometimes you have to write from that to process it, but there's a big difference between processing and publishing.
Yeah. A recent podcast guest talked about the difference between writing from wounds and writing from scars.
Yes, that's a great distinction.
Yeah.
And because we know so little when we're writing it. And, that old idea that we don't see the tapestry until, heaven.
Yeah.
But we don't know how God is at work. And and I think that's part of the definition of faith, too, is trusting out into the future that way. So we don't know what's working. And it is interesting, once we lose people or we're caring for them later in life, or there has been reconciliation or whatnot, we see and understand their wounding and their scars so much better, and what they did and why. And again, not to excuse it, or not that forgiveness equals trust, but we get more and more of the picture as we pray that others will with ourselves too. So not trusting myself to write myopically in the moment, but to think what would be an important thing to convey here, but also respectfully as well.
Yeah. Sometimes when I talk to people about writing memory and writing about maybe hurt that they've had from other people, there is a distinction between... we have this habit of when we reflect on things that happened, of assuming we know what was going on inside the other person. Assuming we understand what their motives were, or why they did what they did. And really all we know is what our experience of that was.
That's really true. That's really true. And we have to be so mindful of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. One thing I was thinking about is once I got the reaction from the habitués who were here about how excited they were that you were here, I thought, this is interesting. Carolyn's going to be in a room of people who know some pretty specific details about her life. Like sometimes you come into a room and people know a lot more about you than you know about them.
Yes. But if they sit with me for 5 minutes, they'll know way more than they want to. Yes, I guess in a sense there is that sense, especially sharing testimony and witness and parts of our lives, that is perhaps more vulnerable, but also, you pray that it will connect with other people in God, and that there will be relationship there between reader and writer.
How would you define relationship between reader and writer?
Well, I think it goes back. That's such a great question. I think it goes back, like we were saying earlier, that we have to be mindful that we don't know the whole story, and only God knows the whole story for each of us. And so, again, when I'm reading a writer, especially if they're currently alive, I try to be always gracious. That, to always give people the benefit of the doubt that they're trying their best, that things might not have turned out as they had planned, or that they were being courageous enough to try and express something that they felt was meaningful to them to give as a gift to you. It might not have a perfect grammar. It might not have the perfect plot twist. It might not have the smooth ending or go the way you want it to go. I think as readers we can be tremendously controlling. I remember reading about Dickens and people being really angry and, writing to Dickens that, so-and-so died, isn't that terrible? And I used to think, oh, that'd be terrible, until I found myself doing it. Live authors, and writing them. I'm like, no, you killed this person off, like, how dare you? So reading is a lot like living. I think that we so much want to control things, and we so much want to spin our own yarn.
Yeah.
And there's a combination of doing that. It's the free will and predestination tension, right? That they're not incompatible. It's just that there's a mystery to it. And so reading in a sense of gleaning what the author is trying to convey to us, and what gift we can get from that, but having, reading with discernment, and reading with respect.
Yeah. I never thought about this until you just mentioned our desire, even as readers, to be in control. But we do live in a technological age where, like, even the news is kind of a choose your own adventure deal now.
That's true. I loved those books when I was little. And maybe it's choose your own adventure that
brought about the algorithms that let us choose our own news feed. I don't know if this is an observation that maybe will result in some discussion. In reading, we are submitting to somebody else's vision. Or said, I'm willing to receive what you have to give. It is is that a fair way to talk about the role of the reader?
I think so. I think that a good reader has a posture of humility.
You mentioned that you have done a lot of academic writing as well as memoir. And one of the frustrating things to me about reading as an academic, it wasn't frustrating at the time, I'm frustrated with myself now, is the extent to which I was approaching reading as judge and jury. I'm here to judge, and I'm here to impose my way of thinking about the book onto the author. In recent years, I've gone back to reread things I read in, say, graduate school, ready to receive rather than looking for what kind of essay I was going to write about it. And it's really transformed my experience with those books. And so you're an academic. How do you talk to me about receiving? Is that compatible? Is that entirely compatible with an academic approach to
reading?
To reading.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, we have to be careful and discerning, even more so than ever, of what we're reading. But honestly, I think it really just goes back to how important the Bible is. And this sounds like such a cop-out answer, but well, culturally, not. But that when we read the Bible, especially as Christians, we read knowing that there's many levels at work at once, and knowing that it's a living word. And it is like Bonhoeffer says, reading Scripture is different than reading a poem about Scripture. It's its own category, it's its own experience. And when we read as Christians, we're trained humanetical readers. We know that there's more than what meets the eye. There's so many different levels of meaning happening in one story or passage or verse. And it's going to speak to us differently at different times as God is speaking to us and what we need or how it's present. And that changes everything, because I think it gives us a template by which we become more trained readers of people and of texts and of life. And so you're always sort of holding up everything else that you're reading or thinking about to that touchstone. And nothing else has that power. There's no other form of literature. Everything I've ever read has pointed to the glory of God, but only Scripture has that kind of, as Madeleine L'Engle says, that sort of depth that we can never plumb to the bottom of. And so when you're reading academic work, sure, of course you can disagree. Of course you can bring judgment to it. I think of Samuel Johnson, right? Ages and ages of astute readers, that you need to have judgment and you need to have criticism and you need to be responding and arguing and thinking and wrangling with the text for sure. But you're always bringing that engagement back to your relationship with the truth and the word. And how that is fitting in to your story within that greater story. And I think even academic, I think all writing has a place within that.
Can we talk about memory for a minute?
Since you couldn't remember your other question.
Yeah, that's right. That's why. Yeah. Do you have any advice for remembering questions? I was reading back through Surprised by Oxford, and the detail with which you describe interactions that happened years before you wrote that is pretty remarkable. Were you journaling? Did you go back to old journals to get these memories?
So I don't have many gifts, but I do have a good memory, to my husband's chagrin. have a photographic memory that my father had, which can be a blessing and a curse. It's not the superpower I would have asked for. We all have superpowers, right? I wish mine was making better sourdough, but like my daughter. But so I have that. And I've just always had it since I was little, but I also have been a lifelong journaler since I was little, and I journal in multiple journals. I'm a journal geek. So I journal dreams, and I journal, I keep track of quotations I love, and I journal neat connections that I see, and things like that. I remember
in different books.
In different books, I have them organized by topics. I also carry small notebooks at times. I learned this from Paul Willis at Westmont. Actually, he said, if you're going to be a poet, you always have to have those dollar store notebooks. And he's like, a phone's not fast enough.
Yeah.
He's like, you just have to always have it, pop it out. I also am. I love to keep things. So I love. I had it long-standing for many, many, many years. My mom adored menus. My mom would have menu anxiety. She loved menus. And we had been very poor growing up in many ways. So like looking at a menu was just really an imaginative experience. And also it would take a long time to decide what you're going to have. And if you're going out to dinner or a nice place, I still get menu anxiety. And so every time I went somewhere, if I had a menu that I was able to take, I would mail it to her. And so at Oxford, I mailed her all the high table dinner menus. And it got to the point there where the waiters were lovely. They would save them for me to mail to my mom. So my mom passed a few months ago, and among her things were all my menus. And so I did remember, for example, I could tell you what I ate on a certain high table dinner, right down to every detail.
Wait, because you saved the menu, or because
I saved the menu?
Yeah, okay.
And oftentimes, and actually because when you're poor and hungry, you remember what you ate. You can remember it. Yeah.
In these journals, do you have a separate journal for my thoughts and feelings and ruminations, and another for concrete details like what I ate today?
I don't do concrete details as much because they're somewhat mundane. I mean, I might if something was like a beautiful memory of something.
Yeah.
I also journal at night to help with anxiety, or in the middle of the night. It's a great menopausal tool. So I do it with Compline often. I have done a lot of spiritual direction work. I have a couple of spiritual directors I really appreciate, and they've worked with me over the years for journaling as well. So I think journaling can be a beautiful thing for processing ideas, for Lectio Divina, for the examine, things like that, for sleeplessness, for just paying attention, cultivating the art of paying attention.
Yeah. When I was young and kept journals, I felt it incumbent on me to be philosophical in journals.
I gave that up long ago.
And now, if I see one of those old journals, it's just really hard to look at. And also,
your kids will love it.
Well, yeah, right. But also, when I remember that era in my life, I know there were things going on. Like I had friends, and I had heartbreak, and I had all kinds of things going on, and none of it was in the journals. Like I would so much more value at this point in my life something that said, in 1990, on December 12th, 1990, here's who I saw today, and here's what I ate. I would value that a lot more than my ruminations.
Right.
When I was, however old, 20 or whatever.
Those are the kind of diaries my mom kept. She'd be like, she went to this movie. She saw Wizard of Oz when it first came out. Yeah. Documented the color.
Wow.
First time seeing color, and everybody in the theater breathing in.
Yeah.
So so I don't mean that things are mundane in a negative sense. And I don't necessarily run on ruminations. I know what you mean. Like sometimes it's really lovely to have little details popped in, but you can do different.
Yeah.
It's also, I think, just so key for particularly I think for a writer to pay attention And we all need to pay attention. We all need to slow down and pay more attention. You think about how Jesus was never hurried. He paid attention to people, and he spoke exactly to what they needed to hear. And it was from paying attention.
Yeah. Longing is such an important theme in your memoirs. Maybe everybody's memoirs, but especially your memoirs. Even the title "Surprised by Oxford" is sort of a nod to C.S. Lewis's book about longing, and joy. And can you talk to me about what longing how longing shapes your writing?
Well, I didn't really have a word for it until probably about a year before I left for Oxford. I remember standing at my back door and feeling this longing, looking outside, and when I arrived at Oxford and I started reading about world religions, I read about Lewis's notion of Sehnsucht, the German notion of longing, homesickness. And it's talked about in Plato and Pythagoras, and there's a long history. And it just clicked, this sense of our heartache for something that's usually aroused by joy. Joy can be a reminder, and we can't go in search of it. It's something that suddenly reminds us of something that we can't quite remember that we're remembering, if you're talking about memory. So why I was surprised by joy when I first read that by Lewis was I was like, oh, he took that from a Wordsworth poem. It's Surprised by Joy, which is a sonnet by Wordsworth, where he talks about being moved by joy, but then realizing that the person he most wants to share it with, that cherished face, is gone now, has passed. And so it's actually something I think we have all felt, right? Where we actually have grieved, but then we are experiencing joy, and then we forget that we shouldn't be experiencing joy, or or that we've lost somebody we would turn to share it with. And that fleeting moment, that Orpheus myth, right? Of what's at the heart of art is that everything is lost double, and we're trying to get it back. And what is it that we're trying to get back that Jesus says we know the way to? And I think with that particular poem, it made sense for me that Lewis would have selected Wordsworth's poem, because then he was also showing how, for us as Christians, however, when we believe in our Savior and we know what he's done for us, that it doesn't end at the tomb. It ends with the tomb being empty. And it doesn't also just negate death or say it's not important. It actually says it's incredibly important, so important that God died as well. But he takes that title that in a way ends, I think, a little short without the hope that the Christian life offers, and infuses it with that hope in the title of his memoir.
Yeah. It took 27 minutes for the Romantic poets to come up. So.
I'm doing much better today.
While we're here, why should we care about the Romantic poets?
Well, the whole reason I chose to study them in particular, I love all of literature, as you do too, right? And you crazy Southerners with your Southern Gothic. I didn't realize that I was really honing in on them because they grappled with longing.
Yeah.
And that's actually what spoke to me, what Goethe called infinite longing. That there is something in us that aspires to the sublime. And the sublime was an aesthetic movement in the Romantic period that became sort of popular. There's the rebirth of the various essays, classical essays and things on it. But what's interesting about the sublime is it holds two apparently contrarial things in one hand. So like a paradox. And a paradox is not an actual contradiction. It's just a seeming one. So what's interesting about the sublime is that you feel both awe and fear. Right? So it's like the mountaintop experience, which is why we see all the paintings at the time. Caspar Friedrich, The Wanderer, different paintings and expressions in music, and that of the sublime, this kind of mountaintop experience where you're standing on the edge of the precipice and you both can see the incredible vista, and you're also slightly nauseous.
How about surprise then? We talked about longing. Let's talk about surprise.
Okay, let's do.
You like surprise?
No. I loathe surprises. That's why I was such a hesitant convert, a reluctant one. It was really inconvenient to read the Bible and realize it made sense. To get to the end of Genesis and think, oh, shoot. I was reading this to make fun of my Christian friends. I was going to, stick my Darwin bumper sticker, where the fish is eating the, cross. I had it all ready to go. And I was like, ooh, this entirely explains the post-lapsarian world. And God is still asking us where we are.
Yeah. What has surprised you lately?
This. In that, God's just outpouring of grace, that he would connect us in a time and place like this, to encourage each other and to meet each other and to walk with each other in him, in this time and place, in this earthly realm. I'm always surprised at those sort of things, his graces, that it's so easy to be, and it's very natural, of course, to be downtrodden or overwhelmed or to feel isolated or have, of course, that's not a trite thing, it's part of being human, but how many graces he sends our way.
Yeah.
I'm continually surprised at his magnanimity.
Yeah. Okay, the last topic I want to broach before we open the floor to questions is, I know you've been doing some thinking about the future of reading for reasons that will become more apparent later. But, yeah. So tell me about the future of reading, some of the things, some of the insights that as you've thought about these things. Tell me about what your, I don't know if I'm asking you to make predictions or... I'm opening the floor to you to talk about the future of reading.
Well, I don't know about the future of reading, but I do know that the Bible will always be relevant. Nothing else is quite what it is. And I also think that it goes back probably to the notion of paying attention.
Yeah.
We are now reading more and more so much quicker. We're reading bits and pieces. We're reading excerpts. Friends of mine who teach in many schools, public schools, have said now most of the texts and reading lists are excerpts. They're not whole works. Yeah. I think it's fine to read an excerpt and have a taste of something, but when you don't read a whole novel, for instance, not only do you not cultivate the art of paying attention, but you are robbing students of their satisfaction of completion. And even if the novel irks them to high heaven, and they want to control the narrative and not be receptive, right? Then they should hone in on what irks them, because that's tugging for a reason. That something that they struggled with years later, they might go back and reread, and it says something completely different to them. So I think we're reading shorter, quicker amounts. We're scrolling and tapping. We're not turning the page. I think there's actually a very physical difference in that too. And that's not because I want to sound like a Luddite. I just mean that I think that there is something about the physicality of books that can be very important, as well as the slowing down, as well as the sharing of books. Now we have so many things that are distilled into a summary, Wikipedia, or books that are made into a quick summary. You're missing the detail that you just pushed your glasses up 3 times in the last few minutes and you're left-handed. All we would have is a quick summary of just what we just said. Yeah. So you don't get the tour around the room that you do with Tolstoy. Yeah. And that's where we're human. We're human in the details. We're human in how we see and how we're seen. We're human in the fact that God knows the full story, and there's so many facets of that story that if we can't become simply about summary, simply about fast-paced or excerpts, I don't want to have excerpted relationships. And I think too, if we become about what we can't even discern as real anymore. It's interesting, the uncanny valley, which is the term that they use, with with visual art when it's produced and it's not quite a human connection. And I think this was anticipated in a novel like Frankenstein, right? Why these novels, why these works are so timeless. But the same thing with writing as well. And because when we're reading writing, we're reading the expression of the whole person, the labor of the whole person. I tell my writing students that your writing is your voice in your absence. It's also your blood and your sweat and your tears and everything else. And you might think, oh, no one appreciates that, but somebody will feel that. You know, and that's part of what's in there too. And so reading, I think, is at a historical crux of something different than it's ever been before. It's probably comparable only to maybe the printing press. And that, I think, increased, obviously, the availability and affordability of print and extended to the masses and the rise of the middle class. But I think now we're at a precipice of something similar to that and as life-changing as that, but in a far more dangerous way for our own inner lives.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd love to open things up for questions. You up for that, Carolyn?
Sure, just don't surprise me.
A quick note here. During our question and answer session, we had an audio issue, and the questions are hard to hear. So I'm just going to repeat the questions from the audience, and then you'll hear Carolyn Weber's answers. The first audience question was about what it was like for Carolyn to see her memoir, her life, turned into a movie.
It was very surreal. And it gave me great hope in the resurrection to see that I could look like that one day. You know, I think when I went and saw the first screening, you know, I had been up all night and tired, and I had a dog throw up and a kid throw up, and I had my husband and I were exhausted, and you know, and I was like, my husband's like, I have hair. I was like, you've had hair for 30 years. We call him, you know, TDH in the book, tall, dark, and handsome, but now he's TBH, he's tall, bald, and handsome. But it was very surreal. We were, again, this incredible circle of grace, right? Like how God is such a show-off with people. Because Ryan Whitaker, who did the screenplay for my film, and it was a long, fun story leading up to that because I never anticipated the book becoming a film. But his favorite teacher ever in his life, who gave him a love for films and wanting to become a Christian screenplay writer, was Greg Wilbur, who was the founder of our college that I now teach in Jonathan's old position. I mean, this is so fun, right? You would almost think it's a foretaste of heaven. And so it was entirely, I never, ever wrote it, ever thinking that would happen. I had been approached a few times about it, but had kept it very private. I really wanted to be careful about it, and I'm careful about the God story too. But when Ryan reached out to me before COVID, he was very thoughtful. My agent said, look, I think he's the real thing. I think his team is the real thing. Ryan is Michael W. Smith's and Debbie Smith's son, if you know them. So really dear people, really thoughtful people. And so he's like, well, let's meet up. I'm going to be, I said, I'm going to be at a conference, a classical learning conference in Alabama or something like that. And he said, well, I won't be far away. So how about we meet up for dinner? I have a really dear friend who's going to be there. And I'm like, great, I'm having dinner with another dear friend, and we could just meet up there. We all show up at the restaurant, and we're both meeting Greg Wilbur. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe it's okay to do the film with this guy. So it was very surreal, but really, and of course it's a whole different adaptation, right, too. So I think as writers, you know, I'm in a room full of writers, we all know that, oh, it'd be great, it's sort of sublime, but a little more vertigo than not, you know, letting someone else. But he was, they've become very dear friends, we homeschool our kids together, so I felt that he was very careful with it. And he wanted unbelievers to really come. Ken Carpenter, too, who goes to our church and was the other director, really wanted people who were questioning the faith or thinking about the faith or maybe antagonistic to still feel comfortable and go to a theater and watch it.
The second audience question was about the future of reading. Given Carolyn's earlier remarks about the threats posed by artificial intelligence, is there hope for the future of reading? And if so, where is that hope to be found?
That's a timeless question because the hope is always with Christians. In our own hearts, but I think also in culture. Christians will always be a reading people. I think the Lord came to us as a baby in a book for good reason. I love the book. But I think that there's just a different relationship with the Word, and knowing that the Word that made all is in all, and words are things to be cared for and tended to. And so Christians continuing to read and read thoughtfully and read engagingly and discerningly with humility and grace, I think is really is where our hope lies. I don't think it's necessarily a dangerous or ominous thing. I mean dangerous in the sense of I worry about the larger reading culture. But I do think Christians are engaged in the forefront of that culture, because we're people of the book.
The next writer asked Carolyn, once you knew Surprised by Oxford was going to publication, did it change the way you thought about your story, when you realized that this wasn't just your thing anymore, but a thing for the wider world?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think you don't fully realize that. Maybe with any book, right? There's sort of this, you become so immersed in the writing of it, in the world of it, that when you actually do birth it and then it's out, you realize, wait, whoa, it is actually out there. And it's hard not to take 1 star from Amazon on particularly a memoir, personally. So there was definitely that kind of, ooh, because I wrote it in so many ways, really for my unbelieving friends and family. I mentioned that before, and students, I just felt this sort of writing it in my closet with children banging outside, just kind of this something so different and unusual for me to have done for my regular writing work. Because academic writing is vulnerable too. All writing is vulnerable, but academic writing, you can still always posture behind, your various intellectual positions and things like that, or there's there's sort of a fencing involved, right? A repartee involved. But when you're writing memoir, you're right, it's very, very vulnerable. And I think I didn't conceive of how much people might respond to your own personal life in a way, but then also how important that is to steward and to honor, and what an honor it is to have people share their stories with you because they've read yours. It's a very, very beautiful and powerful and meaningful thing.
You were talking about relationship, what it might mean for an author and a reader to have a relationship. When you said people tell you their stories because they heard yours. That's an application of that idea.
Yeah.
And finally, this question for Carolyn. You say that in writing about people who hurt you, you tried to respect and honor them. But to what extent did their thoughts about their story becoming public change the way you thought about making the story public?
Well, I think with the manuscript, usually the press will have you make sure that you have permissions from anyone that you might identify, which just completely makes sense. And for most part, for me, that was fairly easy because it was my family. And I remember talking to my brother. My brother was like, yeah, okay, you're a weirdo. And he was hilarious, He thought all Christians were big-haired TV evangelists that took your money. And so he'd say, okay, yeah, you go write about your weird Jesus stuff, that's great. And it was years later, after he reread the book a few times and talked to me about it, and was reading the Psalms when he passed, So you don't know, again, where things will happen at what point. My sister was fine as long as I made sure her hair and makeup looked good in print, And she asked me, could I change her name because she always wanted a fancier name. But I kept the same name, and she was mad at that. She was like, well, I wanted, here are my top 10 names I wanted. So I think that I think if you try to write it carefully, and you have a good editor and everything else, then there's not people who would be upset at how you've presented, especially if you've been careful, or people who gave their permission to be presented in more general ways, or people who are delighted to be, presented. It does make things somewhat easier sometimes when people have passed away. You still write with respect, but then, barring talking to their family or whatnot. But I take, for example, my father, I had written the whole manuscript and wanted him to read it before it went to press. I did not want it to go to press unless my father had read it. And that was one of the reasons we got out to Canada from Santa Barbara at the time, and it was to spend some time on my sabbatical with him. And my father, at this point, I'd always had a relationship with him, but he was in and out of my life. And at this point, he was virtually almost homeless. He had been for some time. He was back in subsidized housing. And I wasn't even sure if he could read it, actually, because he had bouts of mental illness and bouts of clarity. But I felt it was important. And I wanted his blessing on it, or I wanted him to be comfortable about what was being presented. And so I got him the manuscript, and he called me the next day. And I remember exactly where I was. Didn't have to journal this part, but it was a light bulb memory. My husband had taken the kids out, and I had come into the living room. And I remember because my dad called me on the home phone, and I had my cell phone. And I quick texted one of my prayer friends that my dad was calling. And he read the whole thing in a night.
Wow.
Put on a pot of coffee and read almost the whole thing in the night. And we talked, and then he came over, and he talked to my husband and I, and of course it was several days of talking and weeping and talking, and it opened a whole bunch of things, and you just never know how you're going to be surprised. And within 2 years of that, he was taking communion at our church. Yeah.
Love that story.
Because he said to me, how can you ever forgive me? That was one of his responses. And I said to him, how can you forgive me? There were so many things I didn't know and I didn't understand, and I judged you for, or was an angry teenager about. And, so you never know how the written word will have an effect.
Well, Carolyn Weber, thank you so much for being here. This has been so fun.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.